Alright, so today's lecture has to do with emerging adults' relationships with parents. This comic kind of depicts some of the feelings that both parents and emerging adults have during this phase. So in general, what we can see is the number of children living at home has increased dramatically since the 70s. This is the percent of emerging adults at age 25 living at home. You can see that, and this is in 2000, and this number has actually gone up compared to 1970. So the number, this graph is showing from 2000. Since 2000, that number has gone up even higher. This graph is based on the census, and the most recent census actually found that living with parents was the most common arrangement for emerging adults ages 18 to 34. So 32% of them are living with their parents versus 31% living in a spouse. A lot of this may have to do with the fact that emerging adults are getting married later, which we'll discuss in subsequent weeks. So there's a couple of different levels of parent-child relationships. Some parents are extremely involved in their emerging adults' lives. And what we find is generally emerging adults with very involved parents become well-positioned, they interact well with adults, they enroll in a lot more activities in high school and college. And so these extremely involved parents are active in getting their kids into the best schools and colleges, help them get jobs, often help them financially, and this helps the kids academically. With hands-off parents, they kind of assume that their children will live and learn from their mistakes and kind of give them a realistic sense of adulthood by just kind of letting them learn on their own. And then finally, on the extreme end, neglectful and abusive parenting can cause risk or hardship, and of course this has the worst outcomes. In general, what we see when we look at American parents is that these parents socialize their kids for independence, so they value the importance of teaching their emerging adults independence, but they also have a hard time kind of balancing this desire to hang on to their emerging adults as they're kind of leaving the nest versus letting go and letting the emerging adults kind of figure things out on their own. So what I'm going to do next is review some of the current literature about parent-child relationships in emerging adulthood. This is from an article by Uri and Nelson, and what they look at is disclosure. So how much emerging adults play or inform their parents about what's going on. And what we know is that the child's, or in this case the emerging adult's disclosure is the only way that emerging adult parents learn about what's going on, right? If you're a college student, FERPA laws prevent the school from telling your parents what your grades are or anything about what's going on, and so the only way your parents know what's going on is what you choose to tell them. What we find is that children who are more willing to disclose had more positive feelings about their upbringing, so when they think back they feel more positively, and they also have more positive current relationships. So generally what we find is that what happens earlier in childhood predicts how willing emerging adults are to disclose information to their parents. Feelings about their upbringing is a stronger predictor than their current relationship, so it's really important for parents to establish positivity early on in their relationship, because that positivity early on predicts what happens later on into emerging adulthood. But it's also important, of course, for parents to kind of adjust to fit children's current needs. A 10-year-old is going to need very different things from their parents than a 15-year-old, and a 15-year-old is going to need very different things from their parents than a 20-year-old. One thing we know that's really negative is psychological control. And psychological control has to do with manipulation, kind of trying to change how their children feel, doing things like bringing up past mistakes to make them feel guilty or bad. And parents who use psychological control have children who disclose less to them. It also leads to less current relationship satisfaction, which also contributes to less disclosure. And we know, though, that this parent-child disclosure is really important, especially in emerging adulthood. Those who disclose more to their parents are less likely to engage in risky behavior. So this evidence on disclosure really highlights the fact that emerging adults' desire for autonomy and independence doesn't mean they don't also want a positive relationship with their parents. So it's all about kind of finding this balance between independence, but also still getting support from parents. Okay, so you had a lot of readings on living at home. But once emerging adults leave home, there's multiple reasons for coming back. So a lot of them come back because they're recovering from some kind of mistake. They've dropped out of college, they've moved in with a romantic partner, and then that relationship failed. Things like that are common reasons to motivate moving back home. Another reason is because they're saving money for a positive future. Realistically, living at home with your parents is much cheaper, so kind of making that financial decision is also important. Parents also provide important emotional and practical support. So they can kind of, encourage emerging adults to try new things, but also more practical support. They're not paying rent. Mom or dad might do their laundry. Those kinds of things can really help emerging adults, especially if they're at a stressful point in their life. This is just a comic relevant to it. So this is kind of generational differences in how frequently emerging adults move back home. And we'll talk about student loan debt and how that impacts emerging adults when we get to the education section. Okay. There are some differences between socioeconomic status that influences parental support. So what we find is working class or low socioeconomic status families are most likely to provide less support and take kind of a hands-off approach. And their perspectives are basically they had to learn the hard way, so did their kids. So their kids are expected to be out of the house at 18. But what often happens with these low SES emerging adults is that because they don't have financial support, they're forced to choose between work and education. So a lot of them do things like choose to work to pay their bills short term, but what we'll find when we talk about education is that long-term education would lead to more success. These emerging adults have little or less guidance with life decisions, which means they're more likely to make mistakes. But generally, when we look at these lower socioeconomic status kids, they live at home for less time, and they're less likely to move back in, so they do have more independence. And generally, children often want to do what their parents did, but changes in economy and lifestyle means that the same strategies don't necessarily work. So youth who don't have family support often get kind of resentful of those who do get family support because there are substantial differences. So in terms of financial support, throughout emerging adulthood from 18 to 34, parents provide an average of $38,000 to their emerging adults. So parents are giving kids a lot of financial support. This isn't every year, so often parents provide more support early on and then less as they get older. And this, of course, differs dramatically depending on income, but it's proportionally equivalent. And since the 1970s, this number has increased 20%. So we saw the increase in emerging adults living at home since the 70s. We're also seeing increasing financial support. And this really suggests that family assistance is really key to successful emerging adulthood. Governmental help might reduce disparities between families, but family emotional support, not just financial support, could also help explain what's causing this effect. So in terms of how parents kind of balance this during college, one extreme example of parenting is hyper-involved parents. So hyper-involved parents are parents who are keeping tabs on everything the child is doing. Often there are things like Skype or FaceTime, texting, etc. What this means, though, is that the emerging adults aren't making their own decision. They're not becoming autonomous, and as we talked about last week, developing that sense of autonomy and making their own decisions is an important part of this stage of life. So hyper-involved parents means students are making fewer choices. So they're not necessarily making their own choices about what major they want to do, what courses, their social lives, even things like their summer plans. Are they going to take an unpaid internship in their field of interest, or are they going to get a job? And so college has a lot of safety nets built in to help protect students from making poor decisions. But what happens is if parents are hyper involved and don't let kids make potentially poor decisions or make mistakes, these children or these emerging adults don't ever really get a chance to learn how to use those safety nets and how to recover from mistakes. So on average, children of hyper-involved parents talk to their parents almost twice a day. And what we find is the more students talk to their parents, the less autonomy they have. So students come out of college not really seeing themselves as an adult and not really prepared to take responsibility for their actions. Instead, more effective parents should do things like helping students find campus resources to help them. So if a child is struggling with classes, then parents should help them figure out how to get to the tutoring center. Encourage long-term goal consideration, so not telling children what to do, but helping them think about how it influences their bigger picture, and giving students space to grow. This is an example of the kind of extremes of how bad these hyper-involved parents can get. So this is a student, this is from a few years ago, but this is a student who made the dean's list, but her parents were accusing her of doing drugs, being promiscuous, of mental illness. Her parents would drive over 600 miles to make unannounced visits. They did things like installing key logging equipment on her laptop and cell phone, and when she stopped responding, they cut off her money and stopped paying her tuition. And the court actually ended up granting her a restraining order from her parents, and the school gave her a full scholarship. So I think one of the things to think about is, well, do parents have the right to know what's going on with students if they were paying for her college, or should the student be completely independent? Another thing to kind of think about in where parents fit in during college is if their child is a full-time college student, the parents can claim them as a dependent on their taxes, and parental income is taken account on federal financial aid forms. So this really kind of ties the students to their parents. But on the flip side, FERPA laws prevent parents from having access to students' educational records after 18 without the student's permission. So basically, parents are expected to contribute to their children's college fund, but also aren't allowed access to their children's kind of college outcomes in terms of the grade. So this is kind of this thing that really demonstrates that legally we don't necessarily have a good way of balancing this need for parental involvement versus autonomy as well. Another kind of concept that comes up when we think about parent-child relationships into adulthood is filial maturity. So filial maturity is basically the offspring's ability to see their parents as individuals who have past history and limitation. So accepting that your parents have weaknesses and starting to view them as a peer rather than an authority figure. So some of the subcomponents are distancing, so seeing parents as having faults or having bad habits, versus comprehending, so kind of seeing the parent as a place to get advice and sharing feelings and confidence, things like that. And what we find is that filial maturity increases in emerging adulthood and becomes stable in middle adulthood. So it's kind of part of this developmental process and changes in this parent-child relationship. So in middle adulthood, it may be more related to relationship quality, and filial maturity doesn't necessarily develop for everyone. But what we find is that the better relationships parents and children have, the more understanding they have. Filial maturity is also more common among mothers and children, possibly because mothers kind of offer more information about what's going on with them. So that's all I have to add, and the readings should add to this as well.